writings I've followed for decades, so I'm just honored to be on this panel. My job, as I see it, as a historian, is to sort of give a 15-minute historical overview of this topic. Just a couple of caveats. Whenever we talk about any state being progressive or Tea Party or conservative or whatever, that's somewhat problematic because, you know, although Arizona has this reputation, perhaps internationally, as this Tea Party central, there are a lot of progressive bubbles in this state. I think you all know that. You know, yeah. Flagstaff, most of southern Arizona, particularly Tucson, Bisbee, and where we are right now, Central Phoenix, is, you know, where I live. All my senators to the legislature, I mean, all the legislators are Democrats, all of our congressmen are Democrats. Phoenix does not elect Joe Arpaio. This area that we call Arizona, of course, like all of America, was indigenous country, and perhaps because we were so distant and our environment was so hostile, there wasn't this rush to develop it. So it has remained really indigenous country in a lot of ways. We still have 22 tribes. The largest reservation in the country is the Navajo Reservation, which is about 20% of our land mass, etc. Where we are now, Native people were farming here and irrigating here about 3,000 years ago. If you have a chance, go down to the Public Grande Museum on Washington, the original Hoboken Mounds, where perhaps 50,000 people were living here. They're really something to, it's really a story that we need to look at. You know, why did they disappear in the 15th century? But the one thing they built was about 300 miles of canals. So the early settlers here used those canals as a blueprint to develop early Phoenix. So while we're the newest of the lower 48, we have some of the oldest continuously inhabited communities in the country. Up at like Boulder Ivy, up at Hogan, where people have been living continuously since 1100. So it is, and of course its history includes Spaniards and Coronado and, you know, slaves and gold and whatever, but it is this tension between new and old, urban and rural, ethnic, you know, identity that has shaped our politics and will continue to do so. Of course, this area, along with Texas and New Mexico and California, etc., was Mexico, right? Until we declared war on that country in 1846 or 1848. Arizona comes into the nation, not as a state, as a territory, with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. But not all of Arizona, by the way. Those of you from Baja, Arizona know, Tucson area, at the bottom 20%, that remained part of Mexico until we had some purchased in 1854. So that's why you hear when you get down to Baja sometimes, and you may have heard it here, we didn't cross the border, right? The border crossed us. So Arizona comes in, establishes this territory in 1863. It's still mostly Latino and Native American. The dominant language is Spanish. Most of the American is interethnic. But once the Civil War ends, and we start to get the beginnings of trade with the Santa Fe Trail, but once the Civil War ends and the railroads come, commerce really does start to shape Arizona. And after the Civil War, of course, the military is sent here to put down the Indians, right? Which in the Indian Wars effectively end in 1866. This military presence, for instance, makes Phoenix possible. Fort McDowell, which doesn't even exist, by the way. Phoenix does not exist during the Civil War. It's not incorporated until 1881. It becomes a territorial capital in 1889, when again, at least half of its population is still Latino. So at the end of the Indian Wars and the coming of the railroad and the moving of people and product, commerce really starts to shape the state, and that would continue until today. Every child growing up in Arizona learned the 5 C's, right? The ingredients that built the state: cattle, cotton, copper, citrus, and climate. And the thing that distinguishes all of these industries, of course, is that they're extractive. And during the 20th century, Arizona would be one of the leading producers of cotton, copper, timber, and mostly because of these industries, territorial Arizona, before statehood in 1912, is a Democratic stronghold, okay? But it's more what we would probably today characterize as Dixiecrat Democrats. It's not FDR Democrats. It might be progressive, but it's extremely racist. Early miners were mostly Mexicans. They're eventually forced out. They're banned from working in many of the mines. Some laws on the books prohibit Mexicans and Asians from even living in certain communities at this time. So it is this coalition of labor and progressives and politics that really start to clamor for statehood in the late 19th, early 20th century. They work together for what we would call progressive, if racist policies. Labor enacted the 8-hour workday, women's workers' compensation, ban on child labor, etc. So when they're trying to get statehood, originally, at this time, Congress is Republican. They don't want a Democratic state, which we were, coming into the Union because we'll send 2 more Democrats, right? So the plan was that Arizona and New Mexico would come in as one state. Yeah, big state. The reason for that is because New Mexico at the time is largely GOP. It's mostly Hispanic. At the time, the Hispanic population here is mostly Republican. Look at all these switch shifts that are going on. So they wanted it to come in as one state because it would come in then as a Republican state. It would send 2 Republican senators to Congress. The capital would be in Santa Fe. When they put that to a vote of the 2 territories, people in New Mexico approved it by a landslide. The people in Arizona did not. They rejected it, basically for racist reasons. And so it's not until 1911 that there's a proposal to bring the 2 states in as individual states. In 1912, then, on Valentine's Day, Arizona and New Mexico become states. Now, when we talk about progressive Arizona in the title of this, we're mostly talking about that Constitution. It's often looked at as a progressive Constitution for the reasons that I mentioned about labor's things, but it gives a lot of power to the people. It's kind of an executive weak Constitution. People have the ballot propositions, they have the referendum, they have the recall. Women have the vote. This is 7 years before the 19th Amendment. Education, secondary education, college education should, quote, be as free as possible. Boy, we got away from that. 2 things labor did not get, which they wanted. One was a ban on Mexican labor. The other was English only. So President Taft originally balks at signing this Constitution because it had the recall of judges in there. He did not favor that. So the Arizona delegation takes out that provision. Taft signs the statehood proclamation. 9 months later, the Arizona legislature puts it back in. So Arizona, early Arizona is mostly Democrat at the gubernatorial and legislative and congressional levels. Our first governor, Hunt, was a Democrat, a couple terms. Almost every governor through the 30s is a Democrat. At the congressional level, we have a powerful Democrat, and that, of course, is Carl Hayden, the longest-serving U.S. senator in history until, I think, Strom Thurmond broke the record. Hayden, of course, is famous here for bringing water to Arizona. But he also, as a good progressive, sponsored the 19th Amendment, giving the women the right to vote. He lobbied for labor reform, for workers' rights, and he crafted some of the bills that provided for this new conservation movement that was going on, led by people like Teddy Roosevelt, who set aside at the time 3/4 of Arizona's forests as preserves. The first federally recognized protected site was here in Arizona. What do you know? Casa Grande Ruins, 1892, and by the 30s we had dozens more. So, but it's really water where Hayden and the progressive flex their muscles because we needed water for growth and for extraction, and it becomes a political football, which it remains today. Phoenix is here because of Salt River. Roosevelt Dam is constructed in 1911 so they could control the flooding and help with irrigation. But all of these water programs are federal programs, right? The Colorado River Compact is signed in 1922, which decides how the Colorado is kind of the liquid spine of the West. 7 states share it. How would that water be divided up? That's decided in 1922. All the 7 states, except for, of course, Arizona, sign it. We did not sign it until 1944 because we thought we really deserved the lion's share of that water. And with somebody like Hayden in office, we were powerful enough to do that. Hayden lived to see, by the way, the signing in 1968 of the Central Arizona Project. And if you don't know what that is, that's the aqueduct that comes from the Colorado River, clear hundreds of miles, 300 some miles across the desert to Phoenix and then down to Tucson that provides our water. At this time, all of this dam and all this water work is seen as progressive, right? It's providing energy. It's helping to prevent floods. It's helping with irrigation. It's seen as a progressive movement. And it's really not, and even in the 60s, Secretary of the Interior Stuart Udall proposed dams in the Grand Canyon. And it's really not until that time that people start to look at dams in a different way. During the 30s and the 40s, the federal role in Arizona only increases, right? The structure of these New Deal programs and some of this Depression-era programs, unfortunately, puts a lot more power into corporate hands than it does people. The real icon here is a guy named Del Webb. Del Webb built every military base in Arizona but one. He built the 2 internment camps we had here. The 2 largest internment camps were here. He built those. Of course, he wanted to build casinos in Sun City and bring spring training here, etc. But it is a familiar pattern. Depression-era Arizona received, get this, $342 million in federal assistance. We pay $16 million in taxes. And that would continue. That becomes the great irony of Arizona. You know how the Republican majority gripes about Washington, wants to keep Washington out of our hair, yet the state could not exist without federal largesse, whether it's to build military bases or roads or mines, etc., agricultural subsidies. So what happens between 1912 and about 1950 and 60 when the political tide really starts to turn? Now, back about 20 years ago, we did a project that asked this very question. The book came out of it. And we went around the state and we really wanted to know, why does Flagstaff have the political culture that it does, and Yuma has a different culture, you know, all that. And we did hundreds of oral histories with people. Politicians, longtime residents, newbies, etc. And we asked, how did your political culture come to be the way it is? And here's what we found out. I'm really oversimplifying this, but it's what we identified as these demographics of transition. It's always been a transitional state. It continues to change a lot, right? And what we found is it's the shape of our growth. It's not just growth itself, but it's the way that we grow. It's the transient nature of the population. It's our service sector economy, particularly tourism, and it's wars. Wars have always been good for Arizona's economy, right? World War I, we could grow a unique blend of cotton here that provided uniforms for the doughboys, created a huge boom, and then, of course, later a bust. Many of these ranchers, by the way, were Mormons, but when they came here, were Democrats. And Republicans largely hated Mormons because of polygamy and whatnot. There's another shift we could talk about. But it's really World War II when Arizona becomes ground central for military, manufacturing, for training pilots because of the flat land and the empty space, etc. And because we weren't near a border, we weren't susceptible to attack. And also because Arizona's politicians wanted that federal money here. So this World War II, really, this partnership between Arizona and the feds is the thing that will transform the state socially, culturally, environmentally, politically. The military, by the way, considered Phoenix and Tucson to be sort of like dens of iniquity and would even not allow servicemen to come into town because of the prostitution and the gaming and whatnot. That begins the move in these towns for what we might call professional government, charter government, and whatever. One of the first people elected to the new city Phoenix government is a department store owner named Barry Goldwater. He would eventually, in a short time, defeat Ernest McFarland for the U.S. Senate in 1952. If you don't know anything about McFarland, he was the father of the GI Bill. So again, this sort of represents the shift that's going on here. Phoenix at this time, then we see this growth of chambers of commerce and this focus on tourism. And Phoenix begins to compete with other western cities. And the way that they compete, unfortunately, lower taxes, workers' rights, labor, all but dies here. And in this post-war boom then, I mean, think about it, if you were a service person, you were stationed in Tucson during the war, you go back to Michigan after the war, February rolls around, and you remember, oh, I remember Tucson February. And so we see this huge influx. You know, after the war, these people need homes. Again, it's federal, it's FHA, it's VA, of course a lot of them are on the GI Bill. And this shift then is partially responsible. Okay, all right. Let me just talk quickly about this growth that we identified here. Just Phoenix, for instance, 1940, was 65,000 people. head around these numbers. In 1960, it's 440,000 people. Today, it's 1.5 million. In 1950, it's 17 square miles. Today, it's 518 square miles. And this growth, provides for a lot of scamming and things that John has written about, corruption here, but also for entrepreneurs. John F. Long pioneers master plan communities with Maryville in 1955, 125 homes a week. This assembly line approached the building. 1960, Sun City, right? Del Webb, Sun City. They didn't know what to expect. 100,000 people show up the first weekend, they sell out. And of course, the rest is history. So what I want to just emphasize is it's not just this growth, but it's the shape of this growth that we heard more and more. During the 90s, more than half of the people who moved here moved into master plan communities. In Scottsdale, 2/3 of them were in gated communities. And what we heard over and over again in our oral histories was that when people lived in Vermont or whatever it was, they were involved in the school board, they paid their taxes, they were good citizens, and somehow when they crossed the 100th meridian, they become rugged individualists and basically drop out. And it really promotes, as we heard over and over again, this sort of politics of selfishness. I got mine, too bad. Hundreds of oral histories we did in Sun City. They don't want to pay school taxes. Why? Well, I put my child through school in Illinois. Why am I paying taxes here? You hear this over and over and over again. And that, in a nutshell, is the sort of demographics of transition that we identified there. I have a lot more to talk. I could talk forever about how tourism has changed our politics. That's another whole. But again, I think you can see that it is an industry that focuses on churning, people coming and going, transient nature. We're not developing the sort of collective commitment to place, that we need to. And part of it is just the way that we shape communities and the way that we talk about ourselves. Look at early Arizona tourism advertisements, and it's like, come here and be a cowboy, right? Not come here and be a citizen. So, thanks.